Realism in games. It's an interesting topic. Some people might say that realism is irrelevant and any attempt to inject it into a game is a totally counterproductive enterprise. Those same people might say that they don't care about realism at all, and they might be right, but they might not. If they only play abstract games, then it's totally understandable, but otherwise there's a good chance that they have taken any realistic elements that do exist for granted. Hi, I'm Canivan, and today we're going to talk about realism in games, what forms it can take and when it matters. Before we get into the real meat of this topic, we need to clarify exactly what we mean by realism. Depending on which dictionary you prefer, it usually means something along the lines of an interest in or concern for the actual or real. It's a bit of a loose definition, but in the language of media, realism is often used as a catch-all term for things like historical accuracy, authenticity, and believability. Simply put, we can call something realistic without it being a carbon copy, as long as it's either feasible, credible, or has a lot of attention to the right details. You might call a specific city building game realistic because it accurately models finances, civics, traffic, and transport, even though in the real world it would mostly consist of politics, meetings, contractors, and zoning permits. Realism is also a sliding scale rather than a simple on-off switch. Is StarCraft a realistic game? I think everybody would say no. But the human soldiers still use their legs to walk around and appear to be subject to gravity, so that's a microscopic bit of realism right there. But if someone asked you to recommend a realistic strategy game, I doubt you'd offer up StarCraft. I think you'd probably go for something like Steel Division or Warno. Neither of them offer a full, absolute and total recreation of every minute aspect of a battle, but as we said, realism is a scale, and both of those games contain enough of it for us to confidently describe them as realistic. Let's split our discussion into three parts. First, we'll talk about a firmer form of realism, depictions of real or historical things, events and settings. Secondly, we'll look at a more liberal usage, how realism relates to making fictional worlds and stories both believable and credible. Thirdly, we'll take a look at what games can and can't do to improve their levels of realism, and when and why they should and shouldn't worry about it. We'll start with an obvious statement. The primary purpose of games is enjoyment. This might sound simple, but it becomes incredibly complex when you realise that everyone has a different definition of fun. For some it's escapism, for others it's challenge, competition, teamwork or recreation. I think it's fair to say that most people enjoy a mix of some or all of those aspects, and here lies the problem. It's easy to say that the primary purpose of games is enjoyment, but difficult to actually define what that enjoyment should look like. Many people enjoy simulators, a huge genre that covers everything from fighter jets to farm equipment. The more accurate the physics, controls and vehicles, the happier the fans are, something that can be seen in the great efforts some undertake to model their gaming space to physically represent the environment that they're replicating. Realism is a very high priority for these people, and I think it's safe to say that for them, realism is enjoyment. Just as realism is a sliding scale, so's the enjoyment of it. It can be fun to participate in something that resembles an activity that you couldn't or wouldn't ever want to experience in the real world. It turns out that a lot of things can be quite fun if you remove the expense, consequences and monotony, which is why there are so many games that feature city planning, sports and armed conflict. As this is a strategy channel, let's focus on warfare. Actual military activity generally consists of a huge amount of training, organisation, administration, travel and waiting, occasionally interrupted by brief spells of absolute terror and mortal danger. I can see that if you're doing this for real, the boring stuff can actually be pretty appealing, considering the alternative often involves being shot at or bombed. But for a game with no real consequences, this is not a suitable state of affairs. To make a representation of this stuff enjoyable, the mundane needs to be compressed and the excitement needs to be highlighted. No war game can be fully realistic, because real war is a tragedy and games are designed to be fun. Everyone who plays strategy games accepts this wholeheartedly, but just because it can't and shouldn't be 100% realistic, should any attempt at it be abandoned entirely? You see, the quest for realism isn't just limited to Sims. Plenty of combat and conflict games put a huge amount of work into their systems to best replicate what they represent. Let's take War Thunder as an example. The vehicle models are highly detailed recreations of their real-world counterparts, right down to the performance of their engines and weapons, as well as the thickness and position of their armour. The damage model isn't a simple fire a shot, get a hit, reduce some health, but a complex calculation of distance, angle and weapon characteristics, and the damage is based on post-penetration effects to crew and components. Is it a direct and complete replication of real life? No, of course not. But you certainly can't ignore the fact that the level of representation is pretty high, and that it's a big part of what makes the game popular. And what about graphics? We've seen vast increases in graphical power over the years, improving visual clarity in pretty much everything we play. Modern visuals give us a better and clearer understanding of the game world and allow a great deal of spectacle and motion. They don't have to make things look real, but when that opportunity presents itself, people are often in favour of it. I'm sure you've seen footage of Bodycam, an early access title on the Unreal 5 engine. When the preview video was released, everyone was stunned, not because of some highly innovative but abstract gameplay loop, but because it looked so realistic. Video game developers sink hours of time into modelling and animating period-accurate uniforms, weapons, equipment and vehicles. If realism was irrelevant, every soldier would be carrying a smart gun and riding tanks that look like they've been drawn by a 5-year-old. But they don't, which is why so many games that ignore a lot of realistic movement and physics still display highly detailed and animated versions of real-world firearms. Counter-Strike fans don't want a realistic game, but they do prefer the look and feel of real-world guns over that of pulse rifles and las cannons. You see, a dose of reality can add a little credibility and authenticity to an otherwise unrealistic game. This recognition enhances the immersion and in turn increases levels of enjoyment. Nowhere is this more apparent than strategy games, so many of which are based on real or historical events. Not many of these are true and accurate recreations of famous wars or battles, but many of them attempt to provide a partial representation. Even games that aren't too bothered about realism in the actual battle mechanics still lean on the real or historical for credibility. Age of Empires 4 is a really interesting example. Sure, the game engine itself doesn't care too much about realism, the scale is all wrong and you can knock up a castle in a matter of minutes, but the setting is very much historical, as are the factions and their units. On top of this, the whole campaign is interspersed with high quality mini-documentaries, which provide a pretty decent insight into various warfare-related topics of the period. Using real events within a story or a game can help create a special connection between it and the tangible world, making everything just a little more relatable. Important battles, wars and empires, both great and ancient, matter to us, and interacting with them satisfies our natural curiosity about the world about us and the world of those that came before us. Previously, our experience of these events had only been from books, TV and movies, but video games have allowed us to interact with them for the first time, an intriguing concept. The more poignant a period or event, the greater our interest is. We care about these things, and experiencing a part of them, even through the very limited lens of a strategy game, can create very desirable levels of satisfaction and engagement. If nobody cared about the real or tangible, then strategy games would be more akin to chess. They could still be enjoyable, challenging and have tremendous depth, but they would remain totally abstract. But strategy gamers do like a bit of realism, and some a lot more than others. Whole subgenres have sprung up to meet the needs of those who crave experiences with a more solid grounding in reality. Games like Steel Division and Warno exist because some gamers formed the conscious opinion that building a hover tank in 20 seconds and then driving it around a battlefield the size of a parking lot wasn't their idea of fun. Correctly implementing modern or historical settings in video games can be quite a challenge for a developer. You have to be respectful but also provide an enjoyable experience, two things that are often at odds with each other and difficult to get right, but not impossible. As strategy gamers, we frequently partake in battles that are set during very disturbing and troubled times in our history. If a developer decides they want to reap the benefits of real events to enhance the popularity, emotional connection and resonance of their video game, then they also have a duty to treat the subject matter with the amount of reverence it deserves. It doesn't have to be everything, and it doesn't even need to be a primary concern, but it should be a concern. This isn't just true for video games, but any work of historical fiction that wants to use that recognition and emotional connection for a positive effect. Let's consider a couple of fictional movies set during the Second World War, Inglourious Basterds and Jojo Rabbit. Inglourious is obviously not a true story. It tells a tale of such magnitude that you couldn't just write it off as something that could have happened but we just didn't know about it. Most of the characters are highly exaggerated, as are the things they do and the way the plot unfolds. But that period in history was very real, and the director knows that for his emotional elements to work, you need to remember that. The opening scene is exactly the kind of thing that you can imagine did happen during that period, and it does a good job of reminding you about the true horrors and suffering of the time. It's the same with Jojo Rabbit, a comedy about a 10-year-old citizen of the Third Reich who has Hitler as an imaginary friend. It features many over-the-top comedic depictions of events, but every time it starts to stray too far into the absurd, it uses a tragic dose of reality to slap you across the face and remind you that the emotional resonance gained by the use of a historic setting came at a cost. And what a cost! If the scene with the shoes in the third act didn't bring tears to your eyes, then you don't have a soul. These examples aren't true stories and frequently enter the realm of total fantasy, but they both include just enough realism to properly contextualize the period and ensure that you are emotionally attached to the events. It doesn't take much, but just enough of it can really help to build immersion and heighten the emotional stakes. Games require us to frequently suspend our disbelief so we can get on with the business of enjoyment, but a few little touches of realism here and there can go a long way towards bridging the gap. Think of it like this. The shorter the distance between reality and gameplay, the less mental gymnastics we have to perform to forget we're just watching a bunch of pixels light up on a screen. So, that's the harder side of realism out of the way, but what about believability and credibility? Something can feel unrealistic within a game world if it refuses to confer to a pre-established set of rules or events. If a new StarCraft game was released, where Jim Raynor was inexplicably a Protoss who could fly by flapping his arms and shoot laser beams from his eyes, you would be perfectly entitled to call that unrealistic. Not because StarCraft is supposed to be a realistic game, but because Proto-Laser Raynor would not be appropriate for that universe. Games and gameplay experiences are just another sort of fiction, and realism is but one of many tools that authors can use to make their stories more believable and authentic. I'm sure everyone watching this video has at one point given up on a film or TV series because it started to stray too far away from what your brain was comfortable believing based on the facts and characters that had already been established. Game of Thrones is probably a suitable example. It's a total work of fiction, but it had its own internal logic. It was also grounded enough in our understanding of reality that the suspension of disbelief was possible and we could form emotional connections to the characters and events. When the final season rolled around and things started to happen that didn't feel believable or authentic, the suspension of disbelief was shattered and for many people the experience was ruined. Authenticity is something we crave in the modern day. So much of the way we experience life is marred by both overt and covert ways to pull the wool over our eyes. A lot of media, both mainstream and independent, is heavily skewed towards a certain viewpoint. Uncomfortable truths are masked or downplayed and favoured ones are heavily emphasised. Advertisers use every trick in the book to show us their products in the best light, influencers display their highly curated and unrealistic lifestyles, and tech bros wave their next big crypto projects in front of us, promising us they could never fail. Talk show hosts pass off pre-written banter as off-the-cuff conversation, audiences are told to laugh on command, and 65% of us report that we are of above average intelligence, despite the statistical impossibility of that statement. It's a murky world out there, and as such we seek out the authentic, the realistic whenever we can, and we value it. We're not dumb, we know what the state of play is, and an extra bit of authenticity, a touch more realism even in very small quantities, can go a long way to making us feel more comfortable with the things that we're experiencing. Realism in games needs to be applied carefully and in the correct amounts. Too much and it's not enjoyable, but too little creates other problems. There is something called cognitive dissonance that occurs when what you already know clashes with what you see or experience. This won't affect people who are familiar with a game as they've already come to terms with that situation, but it can be seriously off-putting to new players or spectators. This is the feeling you might have had when you first played Company of Heroes 2 and it took 10 rounds from a 75mm tank gun to kill a single soldier, or when you watched a bunch of Terran Marines take down a battlecruiser in StarCraft. This is all cognitive dissonance, and it's initially uncomfortable and off-putting, not a feeling you want players to have when they're experiencing a new strategy game for the very first time. I'm fully aware that there's some things you just can't be realistic with. The clock is one of them, especially in something like a real-time strategy game where you're expected to believe that you can train a soldier or build a tank in a matter of seconds. It's the same with the numbers of units that appear on the battlefield, which at best can be described as representational and at worst totally ridiculous. The reasons for this have changed over the years. Classic games were so limited by technology they couldn't hope to achieve much realism in this department. Command & Conquer looked and played how it did because that's what was achievable. But in 2024 things have come a long way, and you know what? It's okay to expect better. In 1995, animating and pathfinding for 50 units was hard work. But that's almost 30 years ago now, and if games are built correctly they can handle hundreds or thousands of such units. They might not want to for gameplay reasons, but don't pretend that it's some sort of hard technical limit that can't be overcome when even a mid-range system today has many hundreds of times more processing power than we had 30 years ago. There are loads of perfectly good reasons why you couldn't or wouldn't want to create a fully realistic experience. But just because you can't be 100% realistic, it doesn't mean that you should abandon the idea entirely. If this were true, then all racing games would just look and play like Mario Kart does. There are plenty of things that can be implemented to increase the levels of realism in a strategy game without negatively affecting gameplay. We've already mentioned some, like period-accurate weapons, uniforms and vehicles, but what else could be done? In real-time games, construction and production can be brought far more in line with realistic timescales by substituting building and training for assembly and reinforcement. Many of the structures in Company of Heroes consist of repurposed vehicles, camo netting and sandbags, resulting in something that looks and feels like a quick temporary structure that could be assembled in short order. Modern strategy games could do the same with HESCO blocks and prefabs. In the Dawn of War series, the Space Marines don't build a factory to construct vehicles, but instead they place a landing pad, and when vehicles are created, a dropship arrives that brings the unit onto the battlefield. It's not only believable within the world, but it also looks pretty cool at the same time. Oddly, Command & Conquer decided to do both production and reinforcement in the same game. GDI vehicles are constructed inside a factory, whereas NOD vehicles are brought onto the battle ready-made and landed at an airstrip. If your aim is to replicate a large battle, then instead of using a single soldier model to represent a whole squad, why not use a collection of soldiers in a single controllable unit? They don't have to be as large and detailed as the squads in something like Dawn of War or Company of Heroes, but as I've mentioned in another video, work more like the angry mob from Command & Conquer Generals. This huge blob here only consists of 16 units, so it's pretty easy to control. And because each individual is only tiny, it's not much work for a computer to display or animate. However, it clearly shows 160 combatants, an entire company, and would be perfectly serviceable for a real-time strategy game that wanted to show some larger battles but didn't want the player to have to control so many individuals all at once. If a developer wants to build a game where a player only has to worry about controlling something in the region of 10 to 100 units, then the other option is to tell a smaller story. A handful of soldiers feels out of place if it follows a cutscene that depicts a massive battle, but if your storytelling is more considerate to the action, then everything just feels that little bit closer to reality. If we go back to our battlecruiser example from StarCraft, it could have been handled in a very different way that didn't involve shrinking down a vast warship to the size of a tank and having it be vulnerable to Marines and their Gauss rifles. I understand the need to have such a ship in the setting and in the cutscenes, but why couldn't it have been a carrier instead of a battlecruiser? That way you still get your massive impressive ship for your story and your FMV, but on the battlefield itself you could instead deploy a gunship that's been launched from the carrier. That gunship could have exactly the same performance as the current battlecruiser, but it could be dispatched instead of constructed, and its vulnerability to massed Gauss rifles would make so much more sense. Finally, if the demands of realism are deemed to be too heavy and too restrictive for a developer, there are many other great ways to avoid the need for it. You don't have to set your game during one of mankind's many great tragedies. You could do what countless other authors, scriptwriters and artists have done for years and create something different. There are many great strategy games that tell other stories. Supreme Commander doesn't have to worry about realism because it has a totally fictional setting, as does Dune, Lord of the Rings and the Warcraft series. Failing that, Build something more abstract. These games can be just as successful, and there are countless examples that feel no need and have no requirement to have any connection to reality. So, is realism important in strategy games? Well, sometimes. Unless you're making a simulator, it's not the most important thing to consider, but it's certainly foolish to write it off as totally inconsequential. If it's done right, it can enhance a game, and if it's ignored, it can create experiences that just don't feel right, even if you can't put your finger on exactly why. Games that take place during real events or periods of our history can have a greater emotional connection and levels of immersion over those that don't. But using those settings comes at a price, and that price is a careful consideration of realism. Hi there, I hope you enjoyed today's barely intelligible harping about realism. If you thought this message had some merit, then click the like button. And if you want to discuss the topic, then leave me a comment or visit the Discord. And if you want more of this sort of thing, then subscribe to my channel, and I hope to see you back soon.